why would we care so much about how much money there is, the quantity of the money supply? Well, the reason is understanding that is part of trying to manage or maintain the value of a currency, right? Trying to keep inflation in check. So inflation is just a general rise in prices. And so when you have inflation, money is losing its value because as prices go up, my dollar doesn't buy as much. And so my money is losing value. So if I need to maintain a store of value with a currency, I can't have too much inflation. And understanding the total amount of money out there is part of how I do that. So take an example. Right, so let's say there's only so much stuff to purchase in a store, and people have so much money, and you just magically give everybody twice as much money. They all have a lot more money right now, but there's not more stuff to buy. What would happen? Well, people would still want to buy some of that stuff, and they have extra money, so they would start to bid up and push up the prices. So if I just put more money out there without having enough more stuff, I might likely see prices going up, and that's inflation. Is there any way that wouldn't happen? Well, what if I gave people more money and they just sat on it? They didn't go spend it. Well, then it wouldn't be pricing pressure. And so if I give people more money and they're spending it, then there's only so much stuff that I'm going to see upward pricing pressure, unless maybe then there's also more stuff to use my money on. And so that's the general idea of why I need to keep track of how much money there is, along with how much stuff there is to buy and how people are spending that money. So I can formalize this in a notion called the equation of exchange. So the equation of exchange is M times V is equal to P times Y. So M here is the amount of money or the money supply. V is the velocity of money. The velocity of money by definition and concept is on average how many times each dollar is spent. So notice M times V then would be a measure of total spending, right? If everybody has $10 and they each spend it on average twice in a year, then there would be $20 of total spending. So that's M times V. On the other side, we have P, which is the price level, and Y, which is real GDP. So the way to think about this in my store example is real GDP is the amount of stuff purchased, but holding constant prices. We're trying to take away just price changes on there. And so we hold constant prices at some base level and then just measure the amount of stuff. And then P accounts for the average prices of all that stuff adjusted from some base level. So think of P as the price of stuff and Y as the amount of stuff out in the store when I'm thinking about an economy as a whole. And this is actually an identity because velocity is defined or measured as P times Y over M. So what I mean by this is that while velocity conceptually is on average how many times people spend something, it's actually measured in the data because we measure GDP, we measure price levels, we measure the money supply, and we construct velocity as a residual from this actually when you go look it up in the data, which means that in data, this is an identity. It will always hold. It's not just a theory. And I mentioned how M times V is a measure of total spending. How many dollars is it on average? How many times it's spent? P times Y is also the measure of total spending in an economy. So P times Y is nominal GDP, meaning it is the GDP in an economy at current prices. And if you go back into your macro, that is the total spending on goods and services produced this year in an economy. So it is total spending. So we just have total spending is equal to total spending measured two different ways. And again, in the data, it's constructed as an identity. And so I said that this framework or idea could be used to think about a model of inflation or explaining inflation. If I give you a bunch more money and there's not enough more goods to buy, would it lead to increases in pricing? And so I can actually use this equation to construct a theory for that. So I can write the equation of exchange in terms of percentage changes in variables. So if MV is always going to be equal to P times Y, then the percentage change in M times V has to be equal to the percentage change in P times Y, and the percentage change of the product of two things can be very closely approximated by the sum of the percentage changes of the individual variables. So that's all we've done right here. We're saying if these MV is always equal to PY, that means those two combined products have to change in the same percentages to stay equal. And I can very closely approximate the percentage change of those products as the percentage change of the two sums. So that gives me a very convenient formula here. The percentage change of M plus the percentage change of V is equal to the percentage change of P plus the percentage change of Y. And this, the percentage change of P, that's inflation. So now I've got a model for inflation. If I just rearrange that, I say inflation, or the percentage change of P, has to be equal to the percentage change of the money supply plus the percentage change in velocity minus the percentage change of the amount of goods. And that makes sense. If I give you more money, it's putting upward pressure prices, unless there's a lot more stuff to buy, which would pull down that pricing pressure. Even if I don't give you more money, if you just start spending all your money more, upward pressure on prices, unless there's more stuff. And again, if I give you more money, but you quit spending your money as much, there might then offset some of that impact on prices. So let's do some example problems using the equation of exchange. So let's say if people spend $10 trillion and the money supply is $2 trillion, what's the velocity of money? So take a moment, come up with an answer, hit pause. All right, let's see what we get. So we could just use the basic equation of exchange here. M times V is equal to P times Y. So we're told that the money supply is 2. We're solving for V, and we're told that the total spending is 10. So remember that P times Y is nominal GDP or total spending, or M times V has to be equal to total spending. So I have 2 times V is equal to 10, and so that gives me a velocity equal to 5. All right, let's take another example. If people have $3 trillion of money, they spend it on average 4 times a year, and the price level is 1.8. What is real GDP? Again, hit pause, come up with an answer. Okay, let's see the answer here. So again, I can use the basic equation of exchange. M times V is equal to P times Y. And here we're told that the money supply is 3 trillion. They spend on average 4 times a year. So that's our velocity, the amount of times you spend it on average. The price level is 1.8, and we're asked for what is real GDP. So I can solve for Y there. It's just going to be the 12 divided by 1.8, and so I'll get Y is equal to 6.67 or 6.666 repeating. So I have 6.67. Again, we're in trillions for our real GDP. Let's take one more example here. If velocity is constant, meaning it's not changing, and the money supply grows at a 10% rate, and real GDP grows at 3% rate, what would be the value for inflation? So hit pause, come up with your answer. All right, let's see what the answer to this would be. So now I want to use the equation of exchange in its percentage change formulation. So I have percentage change of M plus percentage change of V is equal to percentage of P and Y. So again, it's still MV is equal to PY, but in percentage changes, it's the sum is equal to the sum in percentage changes. So here we're told money grows at a 10% rate. Velocity is constant, meaning its percentage change is 0. We're trying to find inflation, which is the percentage change in price, and real GDP is growing at 3%. So I want to solve for the percentage change in P. So if I isolate that, I have the 10 plus 0 minus the 3, and I have inflation of 7%. And so again, you can see that I gave you 10% more money. You're spending it at the same rate as before, but there is 3% more stuff. So that helps absorb some of that extra money, but 7% of it goes into raising prices. So the equation of exchange is actually most commonly used when discussing the quantity theory of money. And in fact, a lot of people in a lot of textbooks sort of conflate the two things. But the equation of exchange we talk about as an idea. It's concepts that will hold subject to the actually how well I can measure this in the data in the economy. The quantity theory of money takes this and creates a theory. And the theory is basically based on the idea of the equation of exchange. It was actually put forth by Irving Fisher originally, who formalized the equation of exchange, but he then tied it into his quantity theory of money. And the theory was based around the idea that velocity was relatively constant and didn't really change, that people were kind of stable in that. And if velocity is constant, kind of like the example we were just seeing, then increases in the money supply will pretty much largely just show up as increases in the price level. And in fact, if real GDP can never grow very rapidly, and in developed economies, let's be honest, 4% is really, really high. If I have a quickly growing economy, I'm at 6 or 8%. Most of the time, it's around 2%. So if that is not that large, and if I have a big increase in the money supply, it's going to just raise prices. So the idea is that inflation is caused by changes in the money supply. That's the main idea of the theory, and it will hold as long as GDP isn't growing that much and as velocity is constant. So we can check that. GDP does not tend to grow that rapidly. We've talked about that just now. But let's take a look at velocity. So we can actually look at some data from the Federal Reserve that they keep track of and see what we can find. So here is a graph of velocity from the late 1950s up to present. And so you can see that, well, I don't know if that looks constant. Kind of looks like it was going up, then sort of constant, but going up and down, going up more, woo, and then came way back down, and then collapsed in the pandemic and hasn't really come back too much yet. Well, that doesn't look overly constant, but what we're really interested in is the percentage changes over the last year. So I can actually take a look at that and look at the percentage changes like, oh, that looks sort of more constant, except for, the pandemic and coming back. But maybe for a lot, it's sort of constant. But if I look at these percentage changes, it's a swing from, often up to almost 5% to negative 10%, positive almost 10%, negative 8%. It doesn't look overly constant, especially if I'm trying to explain inflation that is well within those bounds of 10 plus or minus 10%. And so it looks like it's actually swinging. Now, if I think about certainly from the 1980s on, sort of barring this pandemic era, if I look at a longer time horizon, say over 10 years, those swings might kind of smooth out. So maybe velocity is bouncing around in the short term, but over the long term, it's smoother. And if that's true, then if I take a look at inflation over longer periods of time, maybe it's tied very closely to what's happening with the money supply growth. So I can pull some data on that. So here is inflation and money growth rates by decades in the United States. And so I can see a fairly positive trend. It's not one for one, which would be a positive trend here. But remember, the quantity theory doesn't say inflation is completely explained by the percentage change in money. It's that minus the growth rate, that the velocity isn't having a big impact. And so if I account for what growth rates might be, that sort of makes sense. We have negative growth in some of these and positive. And so it looks, maybe if I think about a longer term perspective, the quantity theory might hold. Here I've got data internationally from 2003 to 2013. And again, I get a pretty strong positive relationship just looking at money growth rates and inflation. So what's the takeaway then from that? The takeaway then on the quantity theory of money is, what's the link between the money supply and inflation in the short run? In the really short run, it might not be super strong because velocity might be bouncing around a lot. People might have a lot more money, or I took money out and shrank the money supply, but people adjusted their spending for whatever reasons, and I didn't actually get that increased pressure on on prices. And so Fisher thought velocity would be fairly constant because he thought it would be driven by how the technology of the time and the patterns of generally how people use their money. But we find it swings more rapidly. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it, because how much I'm spending my money is tied a lot to, say, consumer confidence and how they're feeling about their future in the economy. And when they're concerned, they hold back on money. And when they feel good, they go out and spend money. And that can be somewhat volatile. So in the short run, the quantity theory of money is not a super great explanation for inflation. What about in the longer run? Well, there it holds up a lot better. We've seen the velocity swings tend to kind of even out. So the idea that velocity is not a major driving change factor over longer periods of time sort of sticks with the data. So if I'm looking at longer term trends in inflation, so what's the average inflation over a decade, then that can be largely explained by what's going on in the change of the money supply, corrected for by what happened with real GDP. And because real GDP doesn't tend to grow that much when I've got hyperinflation, well, then that's largely explained by increases in the money supply. So what's hyperinflation? Well, hyperinflation is really, really, really high inflation. It doesn't have an exact definition of a percentages, but think 50, 100, 1,000 times a month of inflation, thousands of times a year. So basically our currency is very quickly becoming worthless. In those situations, it's always explained by the fact that there is just way too much of an increase in the money supply compared to how much stuff is being purchased. So why would you ever get hyperinflation? So that's a question. Why would countries increase their money supply so much? Usually it's because for political reasons, they've got a lot of spending they need to do, and they don't have enough way to raise that funds from taxes or whatever other resources they have, so they just print money and create money. So some examples of this, one of the classic examples is the German economy post-World War I. So after they lost World War I, it's very common to make the losers pay reparations, so to compensate for all the damage they did from having this war and losing it, but they didn't have the money to actually pay for that, so they just printed money. And you can see images of people with wheelbarrows of cash trying to spend it or burn it or paper over before it becomes so quickly worthless. As soon as I get money, I need to spend it because it's becoming worthless that fast. Zimbabwe used to be a success story for many decades in Africa until the 2000s, and then they made a bunch of changes structurally in their economy, and it did not help economic growth. It destabilized everything, but they had made promises on spending and support they didn't have the money for, so they just printed money and made their currency worthless, so much so that nobody would accept the Zimbabwean currency, and so it quit being a money. And in Zimbabwe, what actually worked as money were either dollars or the South African rand from next door. So you can ruin your currency. So a little bit more recently in the 2010s, Venezuela inflated their currency away to roughly worthless. It's hard to get official numbers from there. The main problem that happened there was, again, a lot of promised social spending under Chavez. And when they had a lot of oil and oil prices were really high in the mid 2000s, that was no problem because the state owned the oil and they could generate lots of income from that. But when the oil market collapsed and the other problems after the financial crisis in 2007 to 2009, in that period, they no longer were able to really meet these needs, and so they started to just print money, and there were inflationary pressures. And what they did with that was basically not allow you to raise prices, so then people either wouldn't produce it, so they'd nationalize it, or you had black market sales, and they had really, really high inflation. So again, hyperinflation is very definitely explained by just rapid growth on the money supply without enough more stuff to spend it on.